long run trend lines are really the key thing when you're looking at budgets. You talked about David Stockman and how he was
Yes.
just depressed and disgusted about not making progress, but he actually did make progress. If you look at Ronald Reagan's fiscal performance, government spending as a share of the GDP was 1 percentage point lower when he left office than when he took office. But that doesn't even capture what he did because obviously there are three big pieces of the budget: defense, net interest, and domestic spending. Well, let's set aside net interest because you can't control that. Defense spending, Reagan obviously spent more money on national defense. And so that amount of the budget went up. On domestic spending, the stuff that he came into office saying, we're going to rein in the welfare state in Washington, Reagan actually reduced domestic spending by 2.5 percentage points of GDP. And by the way, when he left office, according to the Congressional Budget Office, government spending was going to continue on a downward trajectory compared to GDP. Deficits were going to fall as a share of GDP and in nominal terms as well. Now, obviously, what happened? Well, then Bush came in. He increased spending. This is George H.W. Bush, the
Yes.
first President Bush, and he was basically a Democrat. He increased taxes, he increased
Yeah.
spending. So Reagan made a lot of progress that we don't appreciate. Bush unwound some of that progress. Then Bill Clinton comes into office, but almost before he can even do anything, Republicans take Congress in a landslide in 1994. The
Yes.
only really bad thing he did was his tax increases first year, but Hillary Care was rejected.
Yes.
And that was his entire domestic agenda. So he wasn't trying to increase spending dramatically in his first 2 years. He was trying to get Hillary Care, which of course would have increased spending, but he didn't get it through. Then Republicans take Congress, the Gingrich Revolution, as people called it. And what happened? For 4 years, total government spending grew by an average of just 2.9% a year. Now, I, I'm a hardcore small government conservative, libertarian, whatever you call it. I want government to actually shrink every year. But you know what? If your nominal GDP is growing 5, 6, 7% a year,
Yeah.
and your government spending is only growing 2.9% a year, what's going to happen? You are going to shrink government as a share of the private economy,
Right.
GDP. And because revenues tend to grow as fast as the private economy, if your revenues are growing 5, 6, 7% a year, and government spending is only growing 2.9% a year, what's going to happen? You're going to wind up with a budget surplus within a matter of a few years. That's why we got the surplus at the end of the 1990s. Republicans combined with Bill Clinton put the brakes on government spending. Government spending grew at a very slow rate. We had lots of other good economic reforms like welfare reform, deregulation that helped our economy grow fast. And there was a peace dividend. Ronald Reagan's defense buildup ultimately paid off big time with the
Right.
collapse of the Soviet empire. And so, yes, Bill Clinton, domestic spending, it didn't shrink as much as it did during the Reagan years, but it did shrink. But the lion's share of the deficit reduction was from lower spending on national defense. The bottom line is if you want to balance the budget, and by the way, my goal is smaller government, not balancing the budget. I think if you get smaller government, you will balance the budget. But first and foremost, in our minds should be, how do we limit and reduce the burden of government spending? And that's what we did in the 1990s. We started in the 1980s, so we were on a good trend line. There was that hiccup of George H.W. Bush being a tax and spend guy, but then we got back on the right path in the 1990s with Gingrich and the rest of the Republicans controlling Congress, and we got great results. Then, of
And
course,
then,
as you already said, we
yeah.
had 9/11, and George W. Bush, just like his father, was a big spender. It wasn't just building up defense after 9/11. He had corrupt farm bills, pork-filled transportation bills. He
Yeah.
expanded Medicare with a new entitlement program. He was just he was like Trump. He was a big spender.